Imagine an empire so vast that it stretched across 11 time zones, so powerful that it rivaled the United States in every field of war, politics, and science, and yet one day, it simply vanished. No dramatic battle, no nuclear exchange, no foreign invasion. Instead, the world's largest superpower, the Soviet Union, collapsed almost overnight. How does an empire with millions of soldiers, thousands of nuclear weapons, and complete control over half the globe fall without a single shot being fired? That is the mystery we're going to uncover today. The story of the Soviet Union's collapse is not just about politics or economics, it's about people. Leaders making desperate choices, citizens losing faith, and a system built on fear and control slowly crumbling from within. For decades, the Soviet Union stood as the second pole of world power, a giant born from revolution and sustained by iron discipline. It seemed eternal, unshakable. But beneath the surface, cracks had been spreading for years, cracks that no one could repair. In this video, we'll journey through the rise and fall of this empire, examining how the Cold War superpower unraveled, not with tanks in the streets, but with words, reforms, and the collapse of belief. And by the end, you'll see why the fall of the Soviet Union remains one of history's greatest turning points, an ending that changed the fate of the entire world. To understand how it all ended, we must first understand how it began. The Soviet Union was born in 1922, forged in the chaos after the Russian Revolution and the bloody civil war that followed. From its earliest days, it was a state built on contradiction, promising equality and progress, but sustained by terror and repression. Under Joseph Stalin, the USSR transformed into an industrial powerhouse, dragging a largely agrarian society into the modern age with brutal force. Millions perished in purges, famines, and forced labor camps. But by the end of World War II, the Soviet Union had emerged as one of the two global superpowers. It controlled Eastern Europe, spread communist ideology across the globe, and entered into a deadly rivalry with the United States, the Cold War. The Soviet Union was not merely a country, it was an empire disguised as a union of republics. From the icy reaches of Siberia to the deserts of Central Asia, from the Baltics to the Caucasus, dozens of ethnic groups and nations were bound together under Moscow's rule. Its might was not just measured in nuclear missiles, but in its ability to project fear and maintain control. And yet, even in its moments of strength, the seeds of collapse were already there.
The Cold War defined the USSR for decades. The Soviet leadership poured endless resources into the arms race: tanks, planes, missiles, and nuclear warheads. They matched America move for move, from Berlin to Korea, from Cuba to Afghanistan. On the surface, they seemed unbreakable. But inside, the Soviet system was bleeding. While America thrived on innovation and consumer culture, Soviet citizens queued in endless lines for bread, sugar, and basic goods. Factories churned out weapons instead of washing machines. State propaganda promised a workers' paradise, but reality looked very different. The contradiction was glaring. The USSR was a military superpower, but an economic failure. Its power was a facade, held together by censorship, fear, and control. By the late 1970s, the system was creaking. The war in Afghanistan drained resources and morale. The economy stagnated. Leaders aged in their seats, more focused on preserving the system than fixing it. And the people, they began to lose faith. Something had to give. In March of 1985, after years of stagnant leadership under aging rulers, the Soviet Union turned to someone new, Mikhail Gorbachev. At just 54 years old, he was a breath of fresh air in a system dominated by old men. Unlike his predecessors, he was dynamic, energetic, and, most importantly, he understood that the USSR could not survive without change. The Soviet economy was on the brink of collapse. The Afghan war had drained billions. Oil prices, the lifeblood of the Soviet economy, had plummeted. Ordinary citizens were frustrated with shortages, corruption, and an endless parade of empty promises. Gorbachev stepped onto the world stage with bold words. Reform was not only necessary, it was inevitable. His mission? To save the USSR by reshaping it from within. But in trying to rescue the system, he would set forces in motion that he could never control. One of Gorbachev's flagship reforms was perestroika, meaning restructuring. His idea was simple in theory, but radical in practice. Modernize the Soviet economy by loosening the iron grip of central planning.
Factories were given more independence. Farmers were encouraged to be more productive, even allowed to sell some goods privately. For the first time in decades, a taste of economic freedom appeared in Soviet life. But there was a problem. The system was too rigid, too corrupt, too inefficient to handle half measures. Rather than revitalizing the economy, perestroika exposed its weaknesses. Shortages grew worse, inflation skyrocketed, and corruption flourished in the shadows. The Soviet people were promised a better life. Instead, they faced longer lines, empty shelves, and rising anger. Alongside economic reforms, Gorbachev introduced glasnost, meaning openness. For the first time in Soviet history, censorship was eased. Citizens could speak more freely. Newspapers printed criticism of the government. Books that had been banned for decades suddenly appeared in bookstores. It was revolutionary, but it was also dangerous. Because once people began to speak, they unleashed decades of pent-up frustration. Citizens questioned not just their leaders, but the very foundations of the Soviet system. Nationalist movements erupted in the Baltic states, Ukraine, and the Caucasus. Intellectuals began demanding democracy. Workers went on strike. And perhaps most damaging of all, history itself was rewritten. The horrors of Stalin's purges, the gulags, the man-made famines, truths long buried, were now discussed openly. The Soviet Union's own citizens realized their government had lied to them for generations. Faith in the system collapsed faster than the economy. What Gorbachev did not realize was that by loosening the reins, he had unleashed forces no one could control. Economic chaos bred discontent. Openness fueled rebellion. Nationalism surged as republics demanded independence. The Soviet Union had always survived on fear and control. Now, both were slipping away.
And outside the USSR, the world was watching closely. In Eastern Europe, countries like Poland, Hungary, and East Germany, the whispers of freedom grew louder. If Moscow could not even control its own citizens, how could it control its empire abroad? By the late 1980s, cracks had become fissures, and soon, the Berlin Wall itself would fall. The Soviet Union was not just a country, it was the heart of an empire. Across Eastern Europe, nations like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and East Germany lived under communist regimes, each backed, if necessary, by Soviet tanks. For decades, Moscow enforced loyalty with an iron fist. Rebellions in Hungary, 1956, and Czechoslovakia, 1968, had been crushed by force. But by the late 1980s, the world had changed. Gorbachev made something clear. The Soviet Union would no longer intervene militarily in Eastern Europe. The old Brezhnev doctrine that Moscow could send tanks anywhere to keep communism alive was dead. In its place came what Western analysts called the Sinatra Doctrine. Nations could do it their own way. It was a decision that changed history. In Poland, a labor movement called Solidarity, led by Lech Walesa, had been building strength for years. In 1989, Poland held partially free elections, the first in the Eastern Bloc. The result? Solidarity won in a landslide, sweeping communists out of power. For the first time in post-war Europe, a Soviet satellite broke free, peacefully, without Soviet tanks rolling in. The spell of fear was broken. Soon after, Hungary opened its borders with Austria. For East Germans, this was explosive. Thousands fled through Hungary into the west, escaping the suffocating grip of East Germany's dictatorship. The Iron Curtain had been cut open, literally. In Czechoslovakia, protests swelled into what became known as the Velvet Revolution. Students and workers flooded the streets, demanding freedom. The communist government collapsed in a matter of weeks. It was swift, bloodless, and unstoppable. And then came the moment that stunned the entire world, the fall of the Berlin Wall. For nearly 3 decades, the wall had been the symbol of the Cold War. Concrete, barbed wire, watchtowers, guards with rifles. It was more than just a barrier. It was the physical embodiment of a divided world. Families separated, lives controlled, freedoms denied. But by late 1989, the pressure was too much. East Germans took to the streets by the hundreds of thousands, demanding change. On November 9th, after weeks of unrest, a confused government spokesman announced that citizens could cross the border freely and immediately.
Crowds rushed to the checkpoints. Guards, overwhelmed and uncertain, let them pass. That night, the Berlin Wall, once unshakable, was breached. East and West Berliners climbed it, danced on it, tore it apart piece by piece. Tears, laughter, disbelief. It was the end of an era. The images spread across the world. The symbol of communist power had crumbled in a single night, not from war, but from the will of the people. Within a single year, one communist regime after another collapsed across Eastern Europe. Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Bulgaria, Romania, all broke free. Some with joyous revolutions, others with violence, like the bloody fall of Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania. For the people of Eastern Europe, it was liberation. For Moscow, it was humiliation. The Soviet Union had lost its empire. And yet, the greatest crisis was still to come, because the collapse abroad would fuel collapse at home. Nationalist movements within the USSR itself were growing stronger. Republics like Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were no longer whispering about independence, they were shouting it. The Soviet Union was about to face its own internal breaking point. For decades, the Soviet Union had presented itself as a union of equals, a federation of republics united under socialism. But the reality was very different. Moscow controlled everything: politics, economy, and even culture. Ethnic minorities were often suppressed, their languages and traditions sidelined in favor of Soviet identity. By the late 1980s, glasnost had opened a door that could not be shut. National pride and long-suppressed grievances came roaring back to life. People began demanding not just reforms, but independence. The Soviet Union was not a single nation. It was a patchwork of 15 republics, each with its own history, culture, and ambitions. Now, those differences threatened to tear the empire apart. Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, the Baltic republics, were the first to challenge Moscow openly. These small nations had been forcibly annexed into the USSR during World War II, and they never forgot it.
In 1989, something extraordinary happened. Nearly 2 million people joined hands across all 3 countries, forming a human chain over 600 kilometers long. It was called the Baltic Way, a peaceful but powerful demand for freedom. The message was clear. They did not want reforms. They wanted out. By 1990, Lithuania declared independence outright, the first republic to do so. Moscow, shocked and angered, tried to stop them, but the tide was unstoppable. Soon Latvia and Estonia followed, and the Soviet grip on the Baltics slipped away. Elsewhere, the story was the same. In Georgia, protests demanded independence, and clashes with Soviet troops turned violent. In Armenia and Azerbaijan, bitter conflict erupted over the Nagorno-Karabakh region. Ukraine, with its massive population and industrial power, began calling for sovereignty. Even in Russia itself, voices were rising, demanding that the Russian Republic, not the Soviet Union, be the true center of power. Everywhere, nationalism spread like wildfire. The Soviet leadership was trapped in a nightmare. If they cracked down with force, they risked bloodshed that could destroy their credibility at home and abroad. If they did nothing, the Union would disintegrate. They tried a middle path: negotiations, promises of autonomy, attempts at compromise. But it was too little, too late. The republics no longer trusted Moscow, and the people no longer feared it. The empire was unraveling from within, and no one could stop it. Amid the chaos, a new figure emerged: Boris Yeltsin. A bold and outspoken politician, Yeltsin rose to power in Russia by directly appealing to the people. Unlike Gorbachev, who wanted to save the Soviet Union, Yeltsin had a different vision: to strengthen Russia itself, even if it meant the end of the USSR. By 1990, Yeltsin became the president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, the largest and most powerful republic in the Union. He began asserting Russia's independence from Moscow's control, openly defying Gorbachev. For the first time, the battle was not just between the Soviet Union and its republics, but between Moscow and Russia itself. By 1991, the Soviet Union was collapsing faster than anyone could control. Republics were declaring independence one by one. Boris Yeltsin was rising in power, directly challenging Gorbachev. And Gorbachev himself was preparing a new Union treaty, a desperate attempt to transform the USSR into a looser federation, giving republics more autonomy while keeping them united. To reformers, it was a last chance to save the Union. To hardliners, generals, KGB officers, Communist Party elites, it was betrayal.
On August 19, 1991, as Gorbachev vacationed in Crimea, a group of these hardliners launched a coup. Tanks rolled into Moscow. State television announced that Gorbachev was ill and unable to govern. A new emergency committee claimed control, vowing to restore order and preserve the USSR. For a moment, it seemed the old guard might succeed. The world held its breath. But Moscow was not the same city it had been in 1968 or 1956. Decades of fear had cracked. Now tens of thousands of citizens poured into the streets, refusing to accept a return to dictatorship. They built barricades, surrounded government buildings, and chanted for freedom. At the center of it all was Boris Yeltsin. In an iconic moment, he climbed atop a tank outside the Russian parliament building, raised his fist, and declared the coup illegitimate. Broadcast around the world, his defiance electrified the people. For 3 tense days, it seemed Moscow teetered on the edge of bloodshed. But the military, divided and confused, hesitated. Soldiers refused to fire on civilians. The coup leaders, paralyzed by indecision, realized they had lost. On August 21st, the coup collapsed. The failed coup destroyed the last remnants of Soviet authority. Gorbachev returned to Moscow, but he was a weakened figure. His credibility was gone, seen as too weak to stop the hardliners, yet too stubborn to let go of the collapsing system. Yeltsin, on the other hand, emerged as the true hero of the hour. He had stood on the barricades, defied the tanks, and claimed the loyalty of the Russian people. In the battle for legitimacy, Yeltsin had won. The Communist Party was banned in Russia. Republic after republic declared independence at lightning speed. The Soviet Union, once held together by fear, now disintegrated with breathtaking speed. In truth, the coup was the Soviet Union's last chance. Had the hardliners succeeded, they might have crushed the independence movements with force, however bloody. But their failure proved something far greater. The people no longer feared Moscow's power. The spell had been broken. The Soviet Union's days were numbered.
After the failed coup of August 1991, the Soviet Union was living on borrowed time. One by one, the republics declared independence: Ukraine, Belarus, Armenia, Kazakhstan, and many more. Even Russia, the heart of the Union, had begun to assert its sovereignty under Yeltsin's leadership. Mikhail Gorbachev tried desperately to hold on. He still spoke of saving the Soviet Union through a new federation, a union of sovereign states. But no one was listening anymore. The republics had made their choice. The Soviet experiment was over. On December 8, 1991, a secret meeting was held deep in the forests of Belarus. There, the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus signed the Belavezha Accords. Their declaration was simple but historic. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics has ceased to exist. With a few signatures, 70 years of history were erased. The world's largest empire was no more. The final act came on December 25, 1991. Mikhail Gorbachev, the man who had tried to reform the Soviet Union, resigned as its last president. On that same evening, as night fell over Moscow, television cameras captured an image the world would never forget. Above the Kremlin, the red Soviet flag with its hammer and sickle was lowered for the very last time. In its place, the tricolor flag of Russia was raised. No war, no great battle, no nuclear exchange, just silence. An empire that had once rivaled the United States, that had terrified the world with its power, simply ceased to exist. In the blink of an eye, the Cold War was over. The United States stood as the sole superpower. 15 new nations emerged from the ruins of the USSR, each facing its own uncertain future. For some, independence meant freedom. For others, it meant chaos, economic collapse, and ethnic conflict. But one thing was undeniable. The Soviet Union, which had seemed eternal, was gone forever.
The collapse had taken place not with missiles, but with words, protests, and signatures on a page. It was the greatest peaceful revolution in modern history. And so, history asks us, how does an empire fall without a shot? The answer lies not only in politics and economics, but in the hearts of its people. When belief dies, power follows. The Soviet Union fell not because it was defeated by enemies abroad, but because it crumbled from within. And the world would never be the same again. If you found this story fascinating, remember, this is just one of many turning points in history that changed the world forever. For another epic tale of courage, defiance, and impossible odds, check out my video on the Battle of Thermopylae, 300 Spartans versus Persia. You'll find the link on screen now. And don't forget to subscribe to Secrets of History so you never miss the stories that shaped our world.